when the world's most powerful economy teeters on. It is a question few Americans contemplate, yet it is one that has repeatedly loomed over Washington. The debt ceiling, a phrase often buried in financial news and political debates, is not just a bureaucratic footnote, it is a line in the sand, a limit that if crossed without action could trigger consequences reverberating through every corner of the global economy. And in recent years, America has come frighteningly close to crossing that line. To understand this crisis, we must step back. The concept of a debt ceiling is deceptively simple. It is a legal cap set by Congress on the amount of money the federal government is authorized to borrow to meet its existing obligations. It doesn't authorize new spending, it doesn't fund dams, it merely allows the government to pay. The story of the debt ceiling is not about numbers, it is about politics, trust, and the delicate architecture of modern finance. The origins of the debt ceiling trace back to 1917 during World War I. Congress, seeking to streamline government borrowing and give the Treasury more flexibility, passed the Second Liberty Bond Act. For the first time, a ceiling was set, allowing the Treasury to borrow up to a certain limit without seeking individual approval for every loan. It was a practical tool in wartime designed to ensure that the government could meet the extraordinary costs of global conflict. And yet, what began as a pragmatic solution would evolve into a recurring flashpoint of political brinkmanship. For decades, the ceiling was a technicality. Treasury Department officials would notify Congress of the need to raise the limit, and lawmakers would oblige. Between 1940 and 1970, the ceiling was increased multiple times, often without public debate, because the rising costs of war, social programs, and economic expansion made it necessary. The process was administrative, uncontroversial, and largely invisible to the average American. The first major confrontation over the debt ceiling occurred in 1953, when political parties began to realize the power embedded in the process. Suddenly, the ceiling was no longer just an administrative limit, it became a lever for influence. In 1979, the government experienced a technical default due to administrative errors in Treasury bill issuance, a small hiccup, but one that foreshadowed future dangers. The true era of crisis began in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. With a combination of tax cuts, defense spending increases, and a rapidly growing national debt, the ceiling became a recurring negotiation point. Congress was forced to debate each increase, and the public began to notice by the late 1980s that the national debt had risen dramatically, and the stakes of each ceiling negotiation had grown. A failure to raise the limit could mean the government could not pay interest on Treasury bonds, a literal default, shaking confidence in the dollar. Fast forward to the 1990s under President Bill Clinton. The ceiling became a battleground for larger political fights. In 1995 and 1996, the federal government faced partial shutdowns due to disagreements over budget priorities and the debt ceiling. Millions of Americans saw their federal offices closed, paychecks delayed, and public services interrupted. The spectacle highlighted a dangerous reality in a world dependent on the US dollar. Political standoffs over abstract fiscal numbers could have tangible human consequences. The debt ceiling crisis reached new intensity in the 2000s. By 2011, the United States was on the verge of default, driven not by economic collapse but by political brinkmanship. The Republican-controlled House of Representatives, seeking concessions on spending, refused to raise the ceiling without agreements on deficit reduction. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner warned that failure to act could trigger a default with catastrophic global consequences, skyrocketing interest rates, plummeting stock markets, and a loss of confidence in the U.S. as a borrower. For weeks, markets jittered on the edge. Investors watched closely, knowing that a default could endanger trillions of dollars in global assets. Finally, an agreement, the Budget Control Act of 2011, raised the ceiling and included spending caps and deficit reduction measures. But the crisis left scars. Credit rating agencies downgraded U.S. debt for the first time in history, shaking confidence and increasing borrowing costs. The event underscored a new truth. The debt ceiling was no longer just a procedural limit. It had become a tool of political leverage with real-world economic consequences. The pattern repeated in 2013, 2018, and 2021. Each time, the debt ceiling became a stage for partisan brinkmanship, each standoff threatening default, economic turmoil, and global anxiety. During these standoffs, Treasury officials implemented extraordinary measures, accounting maneuvers, delaying payments, and prioritizing certain obligations over others. These stopgap actions bought time but did not solve the underlying problem. The ceiling is structurally flawed in a world of rising national debt and polarized politics. Why does this matter beyond Washington? The U.S. debt ceiling is intimately connected to the global financial system. Treasuries are considered the safest asset in the world. Banks, pension funds, and foreign governments hold trillions in U.S. debt because it is assumed the United States will always pay. A default, even temporary, would ripple through currency markets, bond markets, and international trade. Confidence in the dollar, which serves as the global reserve currency, would be shaken, a shock potentially greater than the 2008 financial crisis. Modern parallels are alarming. Countries such as Greece, Argentina, and even Russia have defaulted, sometimes triggering economic collapse, hyperinflation, or widespread poverty. The US, despite its economic size and stability, is not immune to the consequences of a political impasse. Each debt ceiling confrontation repeats a pattern. Negotiation stalls, markets wobble, extraordinary measures are used, and finally a compromise is reached. But each repetition erodes trust in government, in markets, and in the ability of institutions to manage the nation's finances responsibly. By 2023, the national debt had surpassed $31 trillion, with annual interest payments exceeding $500 billion. Each ceiling negotiation carries greater risk. Even the threat of default influences borrowing costs, interest rates, and investor confidence. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has warned repeatedly that delays in raising the ceiling risk catastrophic consequences, from halted government services to skyrocketing borrowing costs that could depress economic growth. So, what are the lessons? First, process matters as much as policy. The debt ceiling was originally designed for administrative convenience, but has evolved into a dangerous political tool. Second, repeated brinkmanship has real-world consequences. Interest rates, credit ratings, and global confidence are not abstract numbers. They affect jobs, mortgages, pensions, and the stability of financial markets. Third, structural reform is urgently needed. Without a rethinking of how the debt ceiling functions, whether eliminating it entirely or linking it automatically to budgetary legislation, America will continue to play this high-stakes game. The debt ceiling is more than a line in the sand. It is a mirror of America's political polarization and the challenges of managing a modern economy. Each standoff teaches the same lesson: financial stability cannot rely solely on assumptions of goodwill, and political brinkmanship in a $31 trillion economy is a risk the world cannot afford to take lightly. As citizens, investors, and global partners, we must ask ourselves, are we prepared for a real default? Can America find a sustainable path forward that balances fiscal responsibility with political reality? Or will the pattern repeat, each time with higher stakes and greater danger? Understanding the debt ceiling crisis is not just a lesson in economics, it is a lesson in governance, trust, and foresight. It is a story of numbers, but more importantly, it is a story of people, of policymakers, of citizens, and of a world whose financial stability depends on decisions made in the halls of Congress. If this deep dive helped you understand the complexities of America's financial architecture, share this video, subscribe for more documentary content, and engage with history, policy, and economics like never before, because the cost of ignorance is too high in dollars, in trust, and in time.